So welcome to the BSA WEEL group reading group. Today we have Dr. Sara Farris from Goldsmiths. She's a leading sociologist specialising in migration, gender and the political economy of care, renowned for her concept of feminationalism. Her research investigates the roles of migrant and racialised workers in care economies and the financialisation and corporatisation of care services and the racialisation of sexism. Dr. Farris has received support from prestigious institutions, including the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, the European Commission, the British Academy, and the Lieberhuhn Trust. She's the author of In the Name of Women's Rights, The Rights of Feminationalism, and Max Weber's Theory of Personality. Currently, Dr. Farris chairs the Research and Enterprise Network Committee in the School of Culture and Society and co-directs research and anti-racism efforts in the Department of Sociology. She teaches courses on sociological analysis, social change, migration and gender, and supervises related student projects. Dr. Farris's influential work continues to shape contemporary debates on social reproduction and care, and we're honoured to have her share her paper, Corporatisation and Financialisation of Social Reproduction, Care Homes and Childcare in the United Kingdom, with us today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Sara R. Farris. Over to you, Sara.
Thank you so much, Caroline, for this very nice presentation. And thanks everyone for being here and for your interest in this paper, really. I was very grateful when I received the email, asking me to present this paper, because I think it speaks very well to the themes of the study group and the reading group also specifically. And so, I was very glad to be invited to do this. I should say from the beginning, this is a co-authored article with Amy Horton and with Eva Lloyd. They're also very happy that you have decided to focus and to do the reading group today on this. And they were a little bit sorry that they couldn't be here. I was asking if they also wanted to join, but it wasn't possible. So I will do my best to represent this article today. And so I thought maybe I will start precisely by telling you a little bit about the background and the history, what brought us to write this article. So personally, I have been working on issues of corporatization, particularly corporatization of care, for a few years now. My Leverhulme fellowship that you mentioned, Caroline, was precisely on this. I began to do an overview of processes of corporatization across Europe, focusing on 3 countries, in Italy, France, and the UK, already a few years ago. It was before the pandemic. And for that project, my main aim was really to understand the contours, really the kind of shape that corporatization was taking across Europe. And in fact, I published an article already introducing or kind of trying to develop, better to say, this notion of corporatization. The article was published in 2017, and I co-authored it with Sabrina Marchetti, who is an Italian sociologist and colleague. And the article was published in Social Politics, and it was called From the Commodification to the Corporatization of Care. And the idea really was in that article to provide an overview of debates on commodification, marketization, and the corporatization, trying to see, these different stages in the debate concerning really what Claire Ungerson many years ago began to call the commodification of care. So we overviewed this debate, and we were particularly interested back then, a few years ago, in analyzing the increasing presence of large groups in care. But in many ways, this article partly builds on that. But the article we just published is much more. First of all, it is a focus on the UK, specifically on the UK. And I think it is also it's really a refinement of the concept of corporatization, which, as we argue, also needs to be understood in tandem with the concept of financialization. So with this in mind, the three of us, with Amy and Eva, we came together a couple of years ago trying to develop a research project for a grant application on this. And because we wanted to overview precisely these debates, and then we decided that with all the work that we did, we decided also to write this article. So this article really is the result of a conversation and a collaboration between the three of us, trying to bring together these two themes of corporatization and financialization, but particularly to do it across both adult social care and childcare. So the other important thing that I want to say is precisely this. I think one of the main contributions of this article, what we regard as one of the main contributions, is precisely that we want to bring together discussions on corporatization and financialization across the board of care, so both in childcare and in adult social care. And I say this because there have been numerous studies on particularly the financialization of adult social care from the early 2010s onwards in particular. There have been, several reports written in the UK by important scholars in several research centers about the use of financial strategies by care providers, and these particularly intensified after the collapse of Southern Cross. You might remember, maybe, I think it was 2011, if I remember correctly, Southern Cross was the biggest provider of care homes across the country, but it was extremely large. I don't have the exact number of beds and care homes that they had, but we are talking in the several hundreds. And then they went bankrupt precisely because of the ways in which they use the financial engineering and financial strategies. So because of that really was quite of a wake-up call for a lot of researchers working on the marketization of care. And that's also, in many ways, the origin of interest increasingly on the financialization of care. So there is a consolidated if you like, research on the financializations of adult social care. There is less research, although it's growing, on the financialization of childcare. And what we were interested in doing was trying to bring them together and see, okay, so very similar things are happening in these two realms of care. We see across these two realms of care, the growing investment by investment firms, particularly private equity. We see that these large groups are getting larger and larger. They are increasingly dominating care. And in many ways, the financialization of childcare is following in the footsteps of financialization of adult social care. So we really wanted to try to understand, okay, what's going on and what does it mean to bring them together? So this was really one of the main aims of the paper. And also we believe it's one of the main contributions because it's really the first paper that brings them together. And we noted that most studies look at childcare and adult social care kind of discretely. So they focus either on one sector or the other, and for perfectly good reasons and understandable reasons, because these are in many ways different realms. They are regulated differently. They experience in some ways also different processes. But at the same time, there are also very, very important similarities between these two sectors. And the similarities are increasingly not only what I just said, which is precisely these growing processes of financialization, that is one of the main similarities that we investigate, but also the fact that workforces are very similar. So in both sectors, the workforces are mainly constituted of women, and particularly in some areas of the country, and London is one of them, we are talking about mainly ethnic minority and migrant women. Another very important similarity between these two sectors is that these are amongst the lowest paid workforces in the country. So again, feminized and very low paid sector, and they're very highly stigmatized sectors. They don't enjoy forms of, for example, of career progression, or their work is really devalued. And so also because of these similarities, we decided that the second, if you like, a strand of literature that could have helped us to understand and bring together these two sectors was that of social reproduction theory. So because of that, we really introduced the paper by mentioning what I said, but also really saying that what we try to do is to use these two main theoretical frameworks and concepts. So financialization, corporatization on the one hand, and social reproduction theory on the other hand, in order to read these trends and these processes across the two sectors. So just to clarify these concepts, when we talk specifically about corporatization and financialization, there is a distinction between these two. When we talk about corporatization, we are specifically mentioning the organizational structures of these companies. And so here we are building on literature in economic sociology, for example, that looks at how corporatization has been over the last 30 years, one of the main processes through which state-run organizations and companies, particularly in the realm of the welfare state, have been increasingly privatized and organized as corporations. And so corporatization really refers to organizational structures also in terms of governance, corporate governance. On the other hand, financialization refers to really the use of specific financial strategies. So leverage buyouts, resort to loans, all the financial strategies that are used by these companies. And what we argue is that in a way, corporatization is a precondition for financialization in the case of these care providers, large care providers, because some of the financial strategies that they can use, they are really only afforded to them, they're really only afforded to those who have already developed and large corporate organizations. So that's why we think it's important to distinguish them analytically, but also to understand them in tandem in these specific contexts. The second, in terms of the second theoretical framework that we mobilize, we use a social reproduction theory, and really trying to summarize it as best as I can in a short time. Social reproduction theory really here refers to a very broad church, if you like. It's really a broad set of theories that are rooted in Marxist feminism, and that since, well, I guess the genealogy can differ, but I would say that in a more sustained way, it is since the 1960s that several Marxist feminist economists in particular have tried to articulate a social reproduction, what we call social reproduction theory, because they try to analyze, I mean, their specific interest was to understand the relationship between social reproduction, namely the reproductive labor undertaken by women in the private household, so cooking, cleaning, taking care of children, elderly people, what they call the reproduction of the labor force, but also the household and the family. And so what relationship these work had with capitalist production? There is a long debate in this literature, and in many ways, these social reproduction Marxist feminism is an immanent critique to Marxist theories themselves, because, and is also a critique of Marx itself, because Marx, for example, did not recognize women's reproductive labor as productive. There is a long discussion about how this is unproductive labor. And obviously, it is rooted in a certain understanding of productive labor as productive of commodities, as capitalistically productive. So it is not, if you like, a judgment, a value judgment of the type of work. It's simply a description. But at the same time, this distinction between productive and unproductive over the decades really became also a kind of distinction that led to the representation of reproductive labor, not just as unproductive, almost as non-work, to the extent that only work that is considered as productive, capitalistically productive, then has the status of proper work. And instead, women's labor became kind of vocational, as if women are born with the capacity to reproduce and to carry on these activities. So these feminists really were reacting against this representation of reproductive labor as unproductive, as non-properly work, non-properly labor. And therefore, it began really, there were a lot of different theories and perspectives that were put forward. We summarize very briefly a few in the article. There is one strand of social reproduction theory around the wages for housework campaign, for example, that in the 1970s claimed that women's domestic labor was productive of value, of capitalistic values, so of exchange values. And because of that, because it produces capitalist value, it should be entitled to a wage. Maybe I should have said also that in those years, this debate was better known as the domestic labor debate rather than the social reproduction debate. And then later on in the 1980s, there was another school of thought around Lise Vogel, for example, that instead argued that women's domestic work is not productive of value from a capitalistic point of view. So it does not produce commodities, exchange values, but only use values. But nonetheless, it is extremely important and in fact necessary for capitalist production because it produces the infrastructure that enables the reproduction of the labor force and the reproduction of life and households and also capitalist social relations more generally. Now we build on this set of theories that, as you can imagine, they have evolved a lot over the years. In the last 10 years alone, there has been a lot of interest in social reproduction theory, and there has been many scholars in different disciplines. They have, especially feminist economists, but also in economic sociology, in migration studies, they have tried to use the social reproduction theory to understand changes in reproductive labor. So, for example, my main part of work has been on migrant waged reproductive labor, looking at how increasingly migrant women are employed in private households or in institutions to undertake domestic labor or care labor. So I belong more, if you like, to that strand of literature at the crossroad of gender migration and care and social reproduction. But this is to say what for us was important about social reproduction theory, also in these iterations of the last 10 years and different articulations, was the ways in which we think it explains very well why women's labor, women's reproductive labor, whether waged or unwaged, is stigmatized, is considered to be low value, is low paid, and is subjected to these, for example, level of devaluation and stigmatization, as in the case of care labor. So we thought that social reproduction theory is especially useful to understand how the fact that the care workforces, as I said earlier, are so badly paid and they are so stigmatized, devalued, really needs to be understood in light of the fact that this is social reproductive labor that inherits these centuries really of devaluation and framing as women's work that is not even exactly work. And we see that reflected in the ways in which these workforces are treated. This is work that is usually non-professionalized, is not considered to be professional. One of the very interesting things that we use in the article is also to show the importance of social reproduction theory, is the way in which the level of the bargaining power and the level of organization, for example, of the care workforces, both in childcare and in adult social care, is one of the lowest. And one of the reasons, and we said that that's interesting comparing it to the levels of bargaining power, for example, and mobilization or a unionization instead of NHS workforces. These are workforces that have been institutionalized for a long time. We're still talking about care in many ways, but they have been subjected also to different wage regimes and treatment, and to different really representations even in the how can we say, in the representation of labor more generally as more professionalized labor, whereas instead care labor in care homes and childcare is still considered to be like glorified babysitters, as one of the interviewees said in the case of childcare, or just taking care of elderly people and feeding them, as in the case of elderly care, as if it's not really skilled. The other thing I should have mentioned, the idea that this is low-skill labor is also very, very important to understand why social reproduction theory is useful here, because one of the points of social reproduction theory is also to say that women's reproductive labor, precisely because it's been framed as non-work, has also been framed as unskilled. So these are the two main concepts and theoretical theories that we mobilize. And on the basis of that, what we do is in terms of the methodology that we use, we have then compared workforce treatment and workforce conditions in both sectors across the UK. And these last sections of the article are based mainly on secondary analysis of data. So we have looked specifically at skills for care data in terms of wage treatment and workforce condition in the case of care homes, of adult social care, and Ofsted data, for example, in the case of childcare. And we have also we've built also on our own work, because each of the three of us have done also separate empirical work and analysis, secondary analysis work to look at these different sectors, as well as analysis by other scholars on these different conditions. What we note, in fact, is also, as I said earlier, the work on the financialization and corporatization of these two sectors is quite fragmented. They have not been really brought together before. And also, in each case, the work has mainly consisted in, I don't want to say mainly, but mostly consisted in surveys. There have been quite a number of surveys done in order to try to understand workforce conditions, although very few of them have focused specifically on workers in financialized, corporatized settings specifically. So what we try to do really in these last sections was also to bring these analyses together. And what I can say in the end, this is really the article. I think I have tried to summarize most of it. I hope I have not forgotten anything important, but of course we can come back to that in the Q&A. One thing that I want to say is that also kind of on the back of this article and this research, I've also continued to do empirical research on these topics. And just a few months ago, I completed a pilot project in which I looked specifically with another researcher. We looked specifically at, first of all, the main business models of corporations in childcare and adult social care in London. So we focused specifically on London, as I said, it was a pilot project. And also, we interviewed some 20 workers employed exclusively by large companies in London. And we also have a few interviews trying to have a bit of a comparative framework. We also try to do a few interviews with workers employed by not-for-profit companies. I can also maybe later give you the link to the report in the chat, so you can also have a look at this report, which it's been really a lot of work. So I really, it would be great if you can give us really any feedback on this. So what we found out by really trying to speak with workers about what's going on in these companies, in many ways, you know, we were not caught by surprise. So lots of the things we already knew also from other research, it's been confirmed. These workers are extremely low paid. They endure very really bad working conditions in many ways, particularly in terms of long hours. But what stood up in these specific research that I've done recently, for me, were really, I would say, probably two things. The first one is really related to the spread of mental health problems amongst this care workforce, both in childcare and in adult social care. But what was interesting for me, I mean, also, obviously, I'm a sociologist, and so that's the way I read them, but it was not so much burnout, in the sense that these workers were not lamenting, or not exclusively lamenting, the long hours, the stress, but the level, the stress really, and the resentment, and the really sense of frustration was coming very much from a place of devaluation. So a lot of them, most of them really said, we are here, we like our job, we are here to care for children, we care for older people, we want to do our best to do it well. I mean, it's a human interaction, so you want to do your best to do it properly. But at the same time, they felt that their managers in particular were constantly picking up on what went wrong. They were never praising them. They felt constantly like they were just a number. They were not human beings even. And they felt this very strong sense of disposability, and that they were unskilled. And many of them, in fact, especially the nurses in care homes, and even some of the teachers in nurseries, they were experiencing de-skilling, because particularly migrant workers coming from countries in Eastern Europe or in the Caribbean. But in the case of the professional nurses, they said, we arrived here as specialized nurses, I'm forgetting all I learned because I'm not put to do the work that I should be doing. And so there was across the board a process of this skilling going on. In many cases, this was also due, most of these women are working class racialized women. So one thing that would be very interesting for me is also trying to understand these, what they framed as, in a way, mental health and stress, also as forms of injuries of class and race, to paraphrase a little bit what the work, for example, of Bev Skeggs. And so this was one of the things that for me stands out and on which I would like to work more in the future. And another thing that is also an area of research I'm very interested in is also the impact that these corporations are having on the recruitment of migrant care workers in particular. As you probably know, hundreds of thousands of these carers are coming to the UK since 2022. They had to add the carer to the profile of skilled labor in order to have a visa for these workers, precisely because the labor shortage is such that now the main way of addressing the labor shortages in care for the government was to recruit migrant carers from abroad. Obviously, after Brexit, there is no longer all the carers coming from Eastern Europe. And so for me was there as well, it's a particular interesting venue of research to look at specifically at the impact of these corporations on this specific recruitment, and how this recruitment in turn might in the future impact upon further corporatization. Because, for example, it's mainly some of the big companies that sometimes can afford the sponsorships and the fees related to that. So this is very speculative, but I really wonder what this will do also to further concentration in the sector. And so there is also a little documentary that I did with a filmmaker that I will put again in the link, because I think we were also trying, I had this small pot of money to do this pilot research, but I also wanted to find a way to really communicate these results and the working conditions of these workers in a different way, which was not the paper or the report or the blog post. And so we thought a visual, a documentary, very short documentary would be good. And I think it's also good for teaching. I've used it, and I think I think it can be also very well used in that way. It's only 12 minutes long. So again, I will send it to you. The last thing I will say is that also with some colleagues, we now set up a new study group, which is called the Care and Social Reproduction. And the idea is precisely, it's a BSA study group. So the idea is to bring together scholars working at the crossroad of these themes. So if you haven't already, please sign up for the study group. We're just beginning, and it's 2 of us going to be free soon. So hopefully we will be able to do more with advertising things. Yeah, it would be great also if you join the group. Thank you very much. I think I will stop here.
Thanks very much, Sara. Fascinating, really interesting paper as well. And thanks very much for sharing the details of your study group. So we have people that are wanting to ask questions. I wasn't sure who got their hand up first. Elisa, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
It was just a clapping, Caroline, but that's fine. I also have a question. I think we were also clapping and to thank Sara for her presentation. But yeah, so I'll get my question ready in a moment. I really enjoyed your framework, bringing in the concept of corporatization. I've read a lot about marketization, but I think that the idea of the influence of big corporations in the process of marketization is really crucial, especially in this specific sector, because it adds layers, I think, to understanding the relationship and the power balance or imbalance between the employers and the employees, especially in a context where, as you said, we have mostly women and racialized workforce, mostly migrants. So thank you so much. And recently I read a book by Greer, and Amni, and they were talking about how they focus on marketization, not much on corporatization, but they were talking about how this is used as a form of class discipline. And I think it was quite interesting, and how the role of the state in this process, in the whole economy, and specifically in the welfare provision is so important to, carry on this process of marketization. And I just wonder if you saw strong differences between people employed by large corporations, and you also had the chance to interview people from smaller settings, and if you actually get a sense of how different the environment, the pressures, the outcomes for the workers are. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Elisa. I wanted to ask you the reference of this work on marketization as a form of class discipline that I thought was really, really interesting. So yeah, if you maybe can send the reference in the chat, or I don't know.
They wrote a book, but also some articles, but I think I might give you the book, so it's full of references as well. And
yeah, please.
I'll type it in the chat.
Thanks. In terms of the differences, there were some differences. I mean, I have to say that the interviews with the not-for-profit, the employees of not-for-profit providers were fewer than the ones with large corporations. So I cannot say anything that is representative, really. But at the same time, we noted the not-for-profit in the case of childcare, but also in the case of adult social care, they definitely seem to afford a little bit better working conditions, particularly in terms of valuing the workforce. But again, this is, please take it with a grain of salt, because at the same time, they also lamented, I have to say, the ones we were able to interview in the not-for-profit settings, in the case of adult social care, were nurses. So it was a more professionalized workforce already. And they, on the one hand, they felt valued by the company, for example. But on the other hand, they also said there was a lot of turnover, a lot of people constantly leaving, just as across the sector. And so in a way that points to the fact that working conditions might be maybe a little bit better in not-for-profit settings, but they are still, they are still pretty bad. And that's pretty much because of the general framing of care and the low wages that cannot be simply solved by, the good boss or the good company. And so in that sense, one of the things that would be useful to do going ahead, for example, would be, in fact, to do a more focused comparison of for-profit and large corporations and not-for-profit. But yeah, I mean, these interviews seem to point to slightly better working conditions and more valuation and understanding for the workers as an individual as well. Whereas in the larger companies, these workers really felt they had absolutely no connection to the company. They only interface with the management. And each branch had a very specific target. So they were constantly, looking at budgets, and they were constantly understaffed, more than the not-for-profit, actually. And their sense was that the understaffing was on purpose. So was precisely because they were constantly trying to keep costs down.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I think there is a question from Manuel.
You're muted, Vivian. All right.
Yes, okay. Yeah. Hey, Sara, thank you very much for your paper. And certainly we are going to attend the study group because it seems very, very interesting, care and social reproduction study group for BSA. So I would like to comment a little bit and share with you some of our researchers, the Greek studies here in Greece on migrant domestic workers and social reproduction theory. So first of all, I like very much the way that you gather, on one hand, the social reproduction theory by focusing on working conditions as such. I mean, how they are, the time they spend, the wages they have, all of these. And on the other hand, the finalization and corporatization, which is the first time that someone really focus on that to see what's the impact on the social reproduction theory. So I have the feeling that you're working on two, let's say, structural contexts. One has to do with work and working condition, and the other has to do with the large companies that they're trying to, let's say, handle the sector, the care sector. So what we have seen here in the Greek studies, and I'm talking about that because it's another example to compare, because in Greece we don't have, let's say, that much the private sector. It appears and it's expanding, but social care and social services are mostly provided by the state. So what we find out by the interviews with domestic workers from Albania, from Polish, Ukrainian too, is that the state as such, with the strategies that employees, the state employees have applied, were trying to, let's say, make difficult migrant women's worker access to social services. At the same time, the working condition of these ladies within the household where they work, it's a kind of a process that they made these ladies, these women, to incorporate subjectively the way they experience the whole, let's say, private household. So you see, it's a kind of, it's a number of factors that are built in a way that the migrant women workers would be marginalized socially, especially in times of crisis. Mm-hmm. So, and I'm telling you that because you mentioned it, that domestic work, the feminine domestic work is a kind of, let's say, separate theory and social reproductive theory. But in our, let's say, approach is that migrant domestic work enable us to really go in depth to this social reproduction theory. And that's why we have this kind of, let's say, findings. And one final comment also I would like to share with you, because you mentioned one of the interviewees see their self just as numbers. And when you told that, I said, oh wow, what a comparison, because I had some interviews with domestic workers, Albanian ones, working here in the hotel, in services generally, in airport, in catering, such kind of services. And from the narratives, it's become really clear how the service sector have impacted their attitudes, their experiences, the way they live. So their outcome, what they express in their interviews, is that nowadays, let's say the managers in these service sectors, they just see us as a number, not as a person, and they don't have any private time for their life. And you know, so this it's amazing to highlight it, because it's a common future from the people working in the services. Just that. But really, thank you. It's I really loved your paper, and go for that more. More for that, because it's very important to see what capitalism is doing to people's lives.
True, right. So it's 10 to 2 now. So I think we've got time just for a couple of quick questions. So I've put it in the chat. So we're going to go with Manuela first. I think your hand was up first, and then Karen. So go ahead, Manuela.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, questions, I don't know. I wanted to comment briefly on the paper. I'll be brief, and but also share a bit what I'm doing, because I think that there might be interesting kind of overlaps or things that we can share. So I'm connecting from the Industrial Relations Research Unit at the Warwick Business School. So I come from an employment relations point of view. And I loved the paper. I really liked it, because I think that industrial relations suffers from kind of little more sociological, I think, approaches sometimes. And this was just, yeah, perfect, I think. And it speaks a lot to employment relations in a way that perhaps you don't care about, but I do. And I think that for me, what was very interesting was to a couple of things, I guess, that one is that privatization and financialisation, as you nicely say in the paper, corporatisation and financialisation, for me opens the door to a number of other business that comes into what is actually a public service, a public provision. So, for example, the use of data, the use or selling of robots for the hospitals, all these sort of things. So private brings in more private, basically, in ways that can become very perverse over the time. I think that what you show very well, you argue very well, I think it's also how you you put the low paid and low valued work of the workforce in the care sector as a financial consideration for these multinationals. I mean, they haven't by chance come into a sector that is so, and more easily in the care than in the healthcare, that is so low unionized, that has very low collective bargaining power, is of course so much populated by workers that have very few rights to start with. And for me, the key category here is the public versus private nature of the providers. So this is a public service. Very often these are public local municipalities that are buying from private sectors, and it has been increasingly so. And this has kind of created some perverse outcomes in terms of very low collective bargaining results, and not just in the UK. So the UK, I think it's an interesting extreme example. And here I come to the thing that I wanted to share. I'm doing a research on the sectoral social dialogue at the European level. So collective bargaining can take place at the national level. In most European countries, it does. There is sectoral collective bargaining, but very rarely there is sectoral collective bargaining for the care sector. Now, what is interesting is that in December 2023, at the European level, they have set up the sectoral social dialogue for social services. And the reason why it came about, and the research I'm doing, is on the role of the Federation of Social Employers, which was formed exactly to have members, employers that provide social services from the private sector, but very often from a social background. So very often the non-for-profit type of providers. So it would be cooperatives, it would be sometimes some part religious providers, which there are a lot in, particularly I think in continental Europe and Southern Europe. So these employers have very little representations at the European level, and now they've come together with the social employers. But what was interesting that I wanted to share is that the social employers, basically, they had to make a case that there were providers that were providing services for the public sector as private providers. And many members of the European Parliament didn't know, assumed that the care services were, yes, bought out or externalized, but still they assumed that these providers were somehow public or were under public provision. So they had to make a case. And there has been a lot of activism from NGOs as well to try and make a case to have a sectoral social dialogue for the care services. And then I'll finally conclude with the fact that, I mean, we're studying how social employers came about, basically, and what they're trying to do, and many of the things that they're trying to bring to the table of this new level of employment relations at the European level is training, recognitions of skills that at the moment is not there, and it kind of feeds into that devaluation of many professions. But on the other hand, you have the EPSU, the European Public Sector Union, which has always been working with care workers, or has always been working with unions that represent care workers in the different member states. And what they did was to try and establish European Works Council in the big corporations. So, for example, Orpea is also another big provider of social services. It's a French multinational. They've tried to come to Italy as well. And I think they had tried the UK as well, but they left at one point. But they're very, very resistant to have any form of collective bargaining or union representation. So the multinationals make a point about having a very unrepresented workforce, of course, that they can rely and keep cheap and silent, basically.
Thanks, Manuela. Thanks very much. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I know it's like to now, and I want to give Karen the opportunity to ask her question or make her comment, but it's great to see the overlaps here. Sorry to interrupt. Do you want to go ahead, Karen? Oh, you're muted, Karen. We can't hear you. Karen,
so really interesting conversation. Thank you. Yeah, mine was a very quick question just to ask. These are both sectors that are quite highly regulated. I know CQC doesn't really have as many teeth, but Ofsted particularly does. And I just wondered whether you'd picked up anything around childcare and Ofsted in terms of any concerns around this corporatisation, or whether actually you're seeing that actually it isn't really registering from them from a care point of view and a provider quality point of view.
Thank you. Shall I try to answer really briefly? Yeah, I will do it really briefly because we have really 4 minutes. I mean, thank you so much, first of all, everyone, because these were amazing comments, and it's just great to be in a room with all of you who are working on kind of similar issues. So really, thanks. To Viviana or Viviana, I don't know how to pronounce your name, sorry. No, just like, I mean, this is so interesting. And, you know, I have a PhD student who is working on domestic workers and social reproduction in Greece. So, yeah, I just thought, okay, I need to really refer her to your work. She probably is referring already. And, yeah, maybe put the two of you in touch. But no, thank you. Just a little clarification, because probably I wasn't clear. What I was saying is that I don't mean that domestic work and social reproduction work are two distinct things. What I meant was that in the 1960s and 70s, and to an extent probably also the 80s, what we now consider social reproduction feminism went under the name of the domestic labor debate. And that's just because most feminist economists and feminists in general back then were talking about domestic labor, women's unwaged domestic labor in Europe. That's all I wanted to say, but domestic workers and domestic labor is absolutely part of social reproduction considerations. The second, Manuela, thank you so much. That is so interesting. I would really like to know more about this project. And yeah, I mean, I have a lot of things, but we don't have the time. So maybe we can also exchange emails and do it in another venue. But yeah, I mean, I completely, exactly. So what I didn't manage to say very clearly in the presentation, but it's so important, is that we try to say in the article, one of the reasons why these large corporations are investing in care and think they can profit in care is precisely because of the political economy of low wages, because these are not profitable services in many ways. I mean, from a capitalist point of view, right? They are very labor intensive. The margin profits are actually low. So the ways in which they actually are profiting is because wages are very low, but also, as you rightly pointed out, state subsidies are actually high. So they're taking also a chunk of money from the state, from local authorities, and then they're just rewarding investors. So that's hugely important. Karen's question quickly. The issue of regulators is very complicated, because regulators and really a lot of people and scholars who are working on this, I mean, it's been several years now, everyone is saying financialization is bad, financialization of care shouldn't happen. The Guardian now has specialized journalists that are continuously doing very interesting investigative work on the financialization of both childcare and adult social care. So, you know, a lot of people, including regulators, have been really ringing the alarm bell for a long time. In the case of regulators, they have limitations precisely because of the powers they are given, that in some ways are large, but in other ways are very limited. For example, in the case of the Care Quality Commission, one of the main limitations, I guess, is that they could, in theory, close down, and they do, can recommend for closure, for example, of settings that do not meet certain standards and criteria. But at the same time, the ways in which regulation and itself is organized, so they visit at certain points, you know, it's really not fit for purpose in a way, because the reality is it's a more structural problem. It's not just the single branch not meeting the standards. For us, it's really the state allowing large corporations with a for-profit motive to invest in a public service. There is a more general issue here that in many ways in the UK, care is not considered a public service. And but that speaks to another large issue. I mean, it does and it doesn't, but that speaks to the history, I guess, of care in this country, both childcare and elderly care. And I will stop here because the time has run off, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you everybody for your contributions as well. Thanks for joining us today. We have our next reading group around the 15th, 16th or 17th of July. So that's to be confirmed from a specialist in the sociology of work from Melbourne University. Details to follow shortly. So just join me in thanking Sarah, everybody. Thank you very much. And I'll stop the recording there. Thank you, everybody. And have a good rest of your day.
And
Bye,
you.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.